All right, take your Bibles tonight and go to Psalm 139 if you would. Psalm 139. It's good to have the opportunity to preach. It's been a little while since I've preached from this pulpit. I had plenty of opportunities last summer. I preached through the life of David. And tonight I wasn't intending to continue that series, but I ended up returning to the Psalms just based on what the Lord's been doing in my heart lately. So I trust the Lord will speak to us from this psalm tonight. I think it was about June of this year that I got sick of a particular word. It was appearing every time you looked at the newspaper. You heard it every time you turned on the radio. I think if they choose the word of the year this year, this should be the word they choose. And that's the word unprecedented. It seems to appear everywhere you look. Everyone's talking about how the coronavirus is unprecedented. These riots are unprecedented. The things that the president is doing are unprecedented. And so they're going on and about this word. I'm honestly quite sick of it. And sometimes I think we look at the world around us and we think it's just going absolutely mad. It's going completely berserk, and things seem to be unprecedented. And in those times, what's helpful for me is to look at the Psalms. I find so much encouragement and strength when I look at them myself. A few weeks ago, I was driving in the car and turned on the radio, which is always a mistake these days, and heard the word unprecedented again. And I thought, that's enough. And so I pulled out my Bible app and had it read Psalms to me as I was going down the road. And the psalm that it landed on was Psalm 139. And I found it to be just a tremendous blessing to me. David is writing this psalm in an unprecedented time in his life. He was king of Israel at this point. And if you actually turn back just real quick to 2 Samuel 16, we'll see the context here. 2 Samuel 16, David is on the run, which he's been on the run before. But now here he is as king. And in verse 5 of the chapter, it says, And when King David came to Bahurim, behold, thence came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came forth and cursed still as he came. And he cast stones at David and at all the servants of King David. And all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, come out, thou bloody man, and thou man of Belial. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, and whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. And we could go on and read the rest of the passage there, but you get the idea of what's happening here. So David has been careful to follow God's plan for his life. He's had mistakes like any of us have. We talked about it a lot last summer, how he was so careful to do right by Saul and to not attack Saul and not seize the throne before he should have. And so he was so careful regarding Saul. And now here's someone coming to him just completely attacking him for the way he handled Saul. And I imagine that was a very difficult thing for David to hear, knowing that he had bit his tongue so many times, and so many times he had kept other people back from hurting Saul. And so this is an unprecedented time for David as well. And so he writes this psalm, back to Psalm 139, if you'll flip back over there. And I find this to be just an incredibly encouraging psalm. And what he's doing through this whole psalm is he looks at God's character. And when we're in seasons of our life where things seem to be going crazy, we don't know what's going on, we don't know what the next step is for ourselves or for the world around us, it's so helpful for us to reorient ourselves to who our God is, to our God's character. And so we'll just read the psalm all the way through before we get into the message tonight. Psalm 139, verse 1. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my downsitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. Thou compassest my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. For there is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high. I cannot attain unto it. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret, and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being unperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there were none of them. How precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God! How great is the sum of them! If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. Surely thou wilt slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men. For they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee? And am not I grieved with those that rise up against thee? I hate them with a perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, and know my thoughts. And see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So this psalm can be broken pretty cleanly into 4 different sections. And the first section here is verses 1 through 6. And we see David talking about God's omniscience. God's omniscience. And that's just a big word that means that God knows everything. God contains all knowledge. And so first we see, quite simply, that he knows me. We see that in verse 1. O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me. One of the greatest longings that we have as a human in our human hearts is to be fully known and fully loved. And we all have this underlying fear that if somebody truly knew who I was, they wouldn't love me anymore. If someone knew all my deep and dark secrets, they'd pull away from me and I wouldn't be close to them anymore. And so David starts this psalm with this powerful truth, saying, Thou hast searched me and known me. Thou knowest my downsitting and my uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. So it's remarkable. He says, God has searched me, which is the idea of examined me thoroughly, and known me, understood every aspect of me. We can rest in being fully known by God and fully loved by God. Any human relationship we have is going to have friction at some point. There's going to be failings on our side or on the other side. And the closer we get to other people, sometimes there is that risk of, if they find out this next piece about me, they're going to pull away. But thankfully, that's not how our God relates to us. The closer we get to God, the more we sense his love for us. The more we share with God about our daily lives, our daily struggles, our daily temptations, and our daily burdens, the more we sense God carrying us along. And so any fear that we have of God rejecting us as he gets to know us is done away by this verse. God already knows everything that could possibly be known about you, and he's already chosen to love you. So we can rest in being fully known and fully loved by God. And there's no need to chase the approval of anyone else when I am secure in this fact, the fact that God knows me and God approves of me. And then he knows my thoughts. We see that in verses 2 and 4. Thou knowest my downsitting and mine uprising. Thou understandest my thought afar off. And then in verse 4, the phrase, There is not a word in my tongue, but lo, O Lord, thou knowest it altogether. So my thoughts afar off is the idea of God knowing our thoughts even before we do. I can remember growing up in a big family, sitting around the table, and every so often, usually the seasonal flu passes through and someone gets sick. And we all get sick. It goes around. I can remember sitting at the family table, and all of us are just sitting there eating, and all of a sudden, Mom jumps up from the table, grabs one of my younger sisters, and runs to the kitchen, and that sister throws up in the sink. Sorry, it's a disgusting illustration. But none of us had any idea that she was about to be sick. In fact, I wonder if she even knew she was about to be sick. But having 11 kids, Mom was well practiced in this, and she knew that kid's about to be sick. And so before that kid even knew they were going to be sick, Mom grabbed her and ran to the kitchen with her. That's the idea of this. God knows us so well, even before we know what we're going to do, even before we know our own responses, our own feelings, our own thoughts. God knows us in advance. And we can rest in that fact as well, knowing that God knows what's going on in our life, even when we're uncertain and frustrated. The omniscient God knows our thoughts, feelings, and words before even we do. Sometimes I feel like my mind is in a jumble. I'm not sure what to make of my circumstances or my feelings. In these moments, when my mind is a jumble and I don't know which way is up, I can take comfort in the fact that God understands my complicated feelings even better than I do myself. God himself made us. We'll talk about it in a few minutes, how David gets into talking about how God knit him together in his mother's womb. And since God knew us from the point that we were just a thought in his mind, he then knows all the thoughts we have in our mind as well. And I know, especially this year, there's been a lot of stuff going on, and sometimes it's hard to even figure out which way's up, what's going to happen next, how do I feel about the situation, how do I feel about masks, all these different things that people discuss and argue about. And sometimes we feel torn, like, what's the right way to respond to the situation? How should I be thinking about the situation? God knows how we should think, and God knows our thoughts, and God can help us make sense of our thoughts. And I've had times, even recently, where I've said, God, I don't know how I'm feeling about this situation. The world seems like a jumble right now. And so, God, would you show me how I should be thinking? Would you show me what my feelings are about the situation? And God is so gracious and knows us so well, he can help us even with that kind of prayer. And then we see he knows our actions. We see that again in verse 2. Thou knowest my downsitting and my uprising. And then in verse 3, it says, Thou compassest my path and my lying down. The idea of downsitting and uprising is the idea of sitting down to rest or standing up to go to war. David was a warrior, and so when he thought of getting up in the morning, his first thought was, who am I going to face today? What's my battle going to be today? And so when he says this phrase, thou knowest my downsitting and my uprising, he says God knows when I'm laying down to rest, and God knows when I'm standing up to war. Sometimes we can meditate on God in the quiet moments and then forget him as the day gets busy, can't we? And the fact is that David's a warrior, so he's ingrained in this warrior mindset. But the fact is we are warriors as well. God has called us to daily battle. And how often do we rise into the day saying, okay, God, there's a battle today. I don't know what it's going to look like. I don't know what today's battle is. I don't know what next week's battle is. I don't know what next year's battle is. But God, you know my battles. You know my downsitting and my uprising. And you know what I'm about to face. And so God, I'm trusting you with this battle. I'm trusting you with this day. How would it change our perspective on life? And how would it change our perspective of our day if we stood up recognizing I'm about to step into a battle, but I'm stepping into it with the God that knows me and the God that knows my battle? I think it would completely transform the way we approach our work. It would transform the way we approach our relationships. It would transform the way we approach temptations even, if we recognized this is a battle that God is with me in. And that brings us right to the next thing here, which is the phrase, beset me behind and before. We see that in verse 5. Thou hast beset me behind and before, and laid thine hand upon me. I absolutely love this word beset. Usually we don't think of this as a good word in Scripture. Usually it appears when it's talking about a city being sieged by an enemy, or someone having a surprise attack and being sprung on by their enemy. So the word beset usually has negative connotations. But here David is saying, God has beset me behind and before. It's the idea of, have you ever walked a dog that was really clingy? I know I had a puppy growing up that loved to be so close to me that when you walk him, he's like running around your feet, getting the leash all tangled between your legs. That's kind of the idea here. God is so close to you in this moment, you could basically trip on him. How often have we walked through life feeling lonely and feeling discouraged and alone and upset, thinking that God was far away from us, when in fact this verse tells us God has beset me behind and before. God has pressed up so close to us that if we just pay attention, we would feel him in this moment. I know there's been times in my life where I felt frustrated and discouraged and feeling like, I'm all by myself in this journey I'm walking and nobody understands me. God has beset me in those moments. And just like an enemy presses in close for the destruction, God presses in close for encouragement. And closer than any enemy in our daily battle is God. God has pressed in close. He has beset us behind and before. In our greatest uncertainty and in our biggest battle, God is closer than our closest enemy. And then we see David's response here. And that's in verse 6. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is high, I cannot attain to it. If David was tempted to doubt God's knowledge of him and to doubt God's omniscience, these first 6 verses silence those doubts. God is more aware of me than I can imagine, and he knows me even better than I know myself. So in application, we can simply say, God, your knowledge is far beyond my understanding, and so I can trust you, I can rest in you, knowing that you know all things. You are completely omniscient. And then we see God's omnipresence in the next 6 verses here. Verse 7 says, whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? David's asking a question here. It's a rhetorical question, of course. He's shifting to talking about God's omnipresence, how God is everywhere. David is asking the question, what if I wanted to get away from God? So sometimes there's times in our life where we feel like God's far away and we want him close. Other times, I know I've been there at times in my life where I was rebelling against God and pushing back against what God wanted me to do, where I wanted to get away from God. And so David's asking the question, what if I'm in a season of my life where I want to be far away from God? And so then he points out a series of contrasts here in verse 8. He says, if I ascend up into heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, thou art there. Imagine David walking out of his palace and looking up at the night sky and just seeing the infinite vastness of it. Now, of course, we have lots of light pollution, so it's hard sometimes to grasp just the infinite breadth of heaven in our urban areas. I remember being up at Kobiak a few weeks ago, and how many of you guys are out there on the dock at night looking at the stars? I know there's a number of us out there. And it was just unbelievable to be laying out there on the dock, and you could feel the vastness of space, and you felt like about that big. And you could not help but notice how absolutely vast this creation is that God has made. And so David is saying, what if I ascended out there into space and fled as far as I could out into space? I couldn't escape God even there. And then he contrasts it. He says, what if I descend to hell? And the word hell there is the word Sheol, which is the idea of the grave. David is contrasting the vastness of space with the confines of the grave. He's saying, what if I hide in the smallest space? And he recognizes even there, God is there. There's no space so small that I can lock God out. When I was growing up, we lived on a farm that was right next door to a cemetery. And us kids growing up there were very comfortable playing in the cemetery. And sometimes we'd have friends over, and our friends were kind of spooked out by it. And so if we ever played hide and seek with friends, we knew the place to hide is a cemetery, because your friends will never go there, and they're scared of it. And the place to hide, if you want to win a game of hide and seek, is a place where nobody expects to find you. Another time I was playing hide and seek, and I hid in the wood box next to the fireplace in our farmhouse. And it was so small that you wouldn't expect someone to squeeze into there. But I squeezed into there, convinced that no one could find me. And sure enough, they gave up because no one thought that anyone could fit inside that tiny little space. And so David's basically saying here, imagine squeezing into the tightest space possible where no one would think to look for you. Even there, God's presence is there with you. And so no matter how far you try to run from God, whether it's into the vastness of space or the confines of the grave, God is right there with you. Even if it were humanly possible, one commentator said, even if it were humanly possible to build a spaceship to carry us out into the very end of space, or a tunneling projectile to convey us into the center of the earth, God would be waiting for us there. You know, in my worst moments, that's scary. But in the moments where I'm scared and feeling lonely and afraid, that's encouraging. Knowing that no matter where I go in my life, God is already waiting for me right there. And so I don't have to worry, I don't have to fear, no matter where God takes me in this life, because I know that wherever I am going, God is already there before me. He's already preparing the way for me. He's already establishing his path for me. And so I don't have to worry. And then we see David's travels here in verses 9 and 10. He says, if I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. And so if you imagine back to his day there, he says, if I take the wings of the morning, so that's talking about traveling as far possible towards the east. And then if I dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, to the west was the ocean, and the civilized world hadn't spread that far. And so in David's mind, into the mind of the reader of this, they would think that's farther than any man has gone before. And so he's saying, what if I went as far as humanly possible on this globe? What if I ran across the world to try to get away from God? He says there, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. And it's an amazing picture here, because the idea is we are being held in God's hand, right? And so we think, if I'm in God's hand and I start running, well, eventually I'll run off the edge of God's hand. But he's saying, no matter how far you go, if you go as far east as possible, if you go as far west as possible, you can keep on running, and you'll still be in God's hand, and you're still being led by God's hand. There's absolutely no space we can go on this earth that removes us from God's hand, which, if we're trying to run from God, is a scary thought. But if we are feeling like we're missing God's presence, it's an encouraging thought, recognizing that no matter what I do, I am still held in God's hands. There's nothing I can do that takes me out of God's hand. Jesus even talked about that in the New Testament, how nothing could pluck us out of God's hands. We were just talking about that last night with some of the students on campus, how anything we do, anything that anybody does to us, cannot remove us from God's love for us. And then we see David's response here in verses 11 and 12. He says, if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from thee, but the night shineth as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to thee. For us to think that we can hide from God in the dark is as silly as a child closing their eyes and thinking that they're hiding. I think we've probably all done that as a little kid, and I've seen plenty of little kids do that, where you want to play hide and seek with them, they close their eyes. I can't see you, so you can't see me. And it's silly, it's futile, and we laugh at that. But that's how God views our trying to hide from him in the dark. How many people commit sin and crimes and evil deeds in the dark? The Bible says men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. And oftentimes people think that somehow darkness protects them from facing the consequences of their actions. But here he says, even the darkness is light to God. We think that we can run away from God, and we think we can get away from ourselves. And it doesn't matter how far we go or where we go, God is always there. David looks at the darkness and the light and realizes that God doesn't even see those things the way we do. He's saying the darkness hides nothing from God. So no matter where I go, in light or in darkness, God is always working all things together for his glory. I can keep fighting it, I can keep rebelling against it and running, or like David, I can recognize the futility of living life on my own terms and recognize that God is still in control. And then we see God's omnipotence here in verses 13 through 18. He says, for thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being imperfect, and in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there were none of them. And so we see God's omnipotence here and God's mysterious power. He says, you have made my inner parts. And that word literally means kidneys. And so we think about, like, why would he emphasize God making his kidneys? Well, in Hebrew thought, they understood kidneys as being the seat of their emotions, the seat of their personality. And so he is saying that God shaped even my personality. God didn't just care about me in a generic biological sense. God cares about me deeply, emotionally, in a personal sense. And so he's emphasizing the personal nature of God's creative power over him. David is recognizing God is so powerful that he says, you covered me. He's saying God's hand of blessing was on me from the moment of conception. That's the idea of, we talked about being in God's hand. Now this is the idea of God's hand hovering over us. A hand of protection, a hand of love, a hand of care, a hand of guidance. And so he's saying, even from that first moment that you were conceived, you were not a mistake, you were not beyond my care, you were not beyond my provision, my protection, and my love. I had a plan for you from that very moment, and so I put my hand over you to protect you. And so we see God's incredible power extends not just out to space, like he's talked about a few verses before, but extends even right to the moment of conception. And God has a perfect and beautiful plan for us, even from that first moment. From the moment I existed, God noticed me and singled me out for his love. That's a powerful thought. To think that the vast God who shaped the infinite space we see out beyond us cares about me so much that he put his attention on me. He noticed me from that first moment and singled me out for his love and for his plans and his purposes. And then we see God's perfect power here in verse 14. He says, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. He says fearfully, this idea of inspiring wonder. So the perfection of God's creation of me should inspire wonder. Do we look at ourselves and say, wow, God, you're amazing? And that seems like kind of an arrogant thing to say, right? Like when we're like, whoa, God, I'm pretty amazing. Like that seems very arrogant, doesn't it? But that's not what David's saying. He's saying, I look at myself and I recognize that God is an incredible God who made me perfectly and knew what he was doing. And so even looking in the mirror should cause us to reflect on who God is. It should cause us to look at God's character. The culture around us tells us to compare ourselves to others, doesn't it? It's shoved in our face everywhere. It's through advertisements, through social media, through celebrity endorsements, through sports. We're constantly comparing ourselves to others around us. We look at their personalities, their popularity, and their looks, and we wish that we were them. I remember in college being up against other guys that were better students than I was. They were better preachers than I was. They were better musicians than I was. They were better athletes than I was. And I could look at them and feel insecure and feel like, man, I just don't measure up to these guys. And some guys seem to be better at me at absolutely everything. I remember one guy in particular who seemed to have it all together, came to me at one point. He was always kind of feisty towards me. I didn't understand why. It was just kind of frustrating. And he came to me at one point and he said, I'm really jealous of your family. And I'm jealous of a lot of stuff that you have. And I was like, wait, what? This guy has absolutely everything. And I was looking at his life, wishing for stuff he had. And he was looking at my life, wishing for stuff I had. And that's ridiculous. And that's what David's saying in this passage. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. The idea of marvelous is the idea of it's worthy of our wonder, that we would look at what God has done in our life and say, wow, God, you're an amazing God and a perfect God who did everything intentionally. God made you to be you. If you were someone else, there would be a hole in God's creative plan. And then he says there, my soul knoweth it right well. When I stop and think about it, I'm forced to acknowledge that God knew what he was doing when he made me the way I am. Sometimes we live our life so busy, comparing ourselves to others, running about a busy, frantic life. But if we would just stop and ponder who God has made us to be, it would change our view not just of God, but also our view of ourselves. And we would stop striving to be someone else. Instead, we would say, God, you made me the way you made me, and you did it on purpose. You made me for a perfect spot in your plan. And if I was somebody else, I wouldn't be able to fill that spot. And so this causes us to look up and to look in and say, God, you're an awesome God who has done perfect things. And it frees me from that desire to compare myself to others and to hold myself up to others' standards. What if we stopped wishing that we were like someone else? When we accept who God made us to be, we are fleshing out our theology. So in our theology, I think all of us would say, yes, God makes no mistakes. But then in practical life, do we live it? Do we act like God made no mistakes? Or do we look at our lives and think, man, God kind of messed up some stuff with me? It's easy for us to do. It's easy for me to do. To say in theology, yes, God made no mistakes. But then say, God, why is this my struggle? God, why is this my temptation? God, why do I have this circumstance in my life? And so there's a separation between what we say is our theology and the way we're actually living. So what if we united the two and said, God's made no mistakes. And as a result of that, I look at my life and say, God, you made no mistakes in my life. You gave me every struggle in my life so I could glorify you. You gave me every circumstance in my life so I could help someone else on their path to you. You gave me my looks, my desires, my plans, my dreams, my personality, so that I could glorify you in a way that absolutely nobody else could. You know, every planet, every star, every plant is different from each other, and each of them uniquely glorifies God, and every person is different from each other. And you can glorify God in your body and in your personality in a way that absolutely nobody else on this world can. And as long as we're living our life comparing it to others and wishing that God had made us into somebody else, we're missing out on that incredible opportunity to uniquely reflect God's character to those around us and to the world around us. And so we have to shift our theology then and say, okay, God, I recognize now you have made no mistakes in general and specifically when you made me. And then we see God's pervasive power here in verses 15 and 16. My substance was not hid from thee when I was made in secret and curiously wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see my substance, yet being imperfect. And in thy book all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned when as yet there were none of them. So in these next few verses, David is connecting his substance, the essence of who he is, with God's power. He's saying my very being is connected with God's thoughts. Before I existed in actuality, I existed in God's thoughts. And again, that's a powerful and humbling thought, to think that the God who shaped the universe thought of me. I existed first as an idea in God's head. How remarkable is that? Sometimes we think of God as being this distant father figure, right? We think of him as being so far away from us, and yes, he's told us how to live through his word, and yes, we hear from him through preaching and through reading his word, but has he ever really thought about me? And the fact is, your first existence was actually a thought in God's head. God had this thought, I can most glorify myself by creating this specific person, and then I'm going to flesh the idea out, and I'm going to actually make that person. And so your very being, who you are right now, your material essence, is tied initially to that thought that God had about you. Which in continuance were fashioned, when as yet there were none of them, is what he says here. How amazing is that? The all-powerful God of the universe values you so much that he thought of you before you were born, and then said, that's a good thought, and made you. Every cell and molecule in the human body is a result of God's thoughts. God created Adam with a design in mind. The organization of the human body, structurally and organically, is a true wonder of wonders, where there is a place for everything and everything in its place. Every human body is alike in its basic organization, and yet there is also individuality of DNA and fingerprints and personality. So we see here that God has created, yes, humans in general, but created us specifically to be specially reflective of him. And then we see God's good thoughts here in verses 17 and 18. He says, how precious also are thy thoughts unto me, O God. How great is the sum of them. If I should count them, they are more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with thee. So if there is any question whether or not God has ever thought of you, here in these verses he's saying not only has God thought about you, he's thought good thoughts about you. And he's thought so many of them that they are more in number than even the sand on the sea. And so never again should we question whether God thinks of us. Never should we question whether God notices us in our day-to-day lives. Never should we question if God cares about us during our daily struggles, because here he's completely settled that and said God has thought uncountable numbers of good thoughts towards you, of good thoughts about you. Sometimes we are surrounded by hard circumstances, or we run from God, and we don't think of God as having our best interests in mind. But these verses confront that error. They say that all of God's thoughts towards us are good. Have you ever felt like God was thinking evil thoughts towards you? I know I felt that before. My car breaks down, I don't have enough money, all this stuff goes wrong. It's like, God, what are you doing to me? God, why do you have all these evil thoughts towards me? And he says, no, God has good thoughts towards you. In our perspective, it doesn't feel like it sometimes, does it? So today, actually, I was at Pastor's house. He's out of town right now, and he's asked me to watch his chickens for him. So I'm collecting the eggs, I'm feeding them, and then he said, if you have time, let them out for a little bit of grass and fresh air, and then round them up and put them back in the coop. Sounds easy, right? So he said, it's super easy to put them back in the coop. All you have to do is put a little bit of feed in a bucket, go around the yard and rattle it a little bit, and they'll hear it, and they'll follow you and go right into the coop. It's like, okay, great, sounds good. So I set up on the patio over there while the chickens were out. I did a little bit of studying, did a little work, and then I thought, okay, it's been a few hours, they can probably go back in now. And so I went and got the chicken feed, put it in the bucket as instructed, and then went walking around the yard to the chickens. The chickens looked at me and ran the opposite direction. I was like, oh, great. So why do they have to be put back in the coop? Well, there's been a hawk, apparently, that's been hovering over Pastor's yard, and they're afraid he's going to kill one of the chickens, which they will do. And so I had good thoughts towards these chickens. I wanted to give them food. I want to get them back in the coop to keep them safe from a hawk. Like, what better thoughts could I have towards these chickens? But their silly little chicken brains couldn't wrap their heads around that, and they thought, no, it's way better to be out here in freedom. And so they were running in circles. So I caught them, like literally 2 at a time, drug them back to the coop, shut them in, closed the door, then off to chase more of them. And it was quite a long ordeal. And so they were running because they thought I had their worst intention in mind. The whole time I had their best intention in mind. Now imagine us in relation to God. How often do we run from his plan thinking he has evil thoughts towards us? How often do we chafe against his plan for us, saying, okay, God, I'll do what you tell me to do, but I don't like it? When actually God has a good plan for us. Just like my plans were good for those chickens and they couldn't comprehend it at the time, I think they're happy now because they're inside their safe coop. Hopefully they're still in their safe coop. And they're protected from hawks and raccoons and coyotes. But if they had still been running around and following their own way, they'd have been so much more vulnerable to all sorts of terrible things. And that's how we are. When we look at God and his plans for us and say, these aren't good, God doesn't think good thoughts towards me, we tend to run from his plan for us. And then we open ourselves up to so many more dangers. And so we have to orient ourselves to God's character in challenging times and say, God, you're thinking not just good thoughts towards me, but innumerable good thoughts towards me. You're thinking all the good thoughts towards me. There could not be more good things that you want to do towards me. And so even when I feel like my life is going sideways, even when I can't quite grasp why this is happening in my life, you are doing good things, and I choose to trust you and follow you joyfully in this season. We have to get over this low view of ourselves and live confidently, knowing that God has created us, shaped us from the moment that we were just a thought in his brain, all the way to his good thoughts towards us now. And then we see God's omnipurity, or God's holiness, and that's in verses 19 through 24. It says, surely thou wilt slay the wicked, O God. Depart from me, therefore, ye bloody men. For they speak against thee wickedly, and thine enemies take thy name in vain. Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee, and am not I grieved with those that rise up against thee? I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. So this really seems like a change in tone, doesn't it? He's just been talking about how good God is, about God's good thoughts towards us, about God's plan for us from before we were even conceived. And now he's talking about God will slay the wicked. I hate them with perfect hatred. I count them mine enemies. So what's changed here? Has God changed? No. The difference is our reaction to God. So if we choose to keep running from God like the chickens kept running from me, the only possible end is destruction. And so that's what he's pointing out there here, is that these people have interacted with God's character in such a way that the only possible end for them is destruction. Based on all that David has said about God, we have to consider how his character informs his interactions with us and with others. The destiny of all those who hate God is clear, and the destiny of all those who persist in running from God is clear. Sometimes we look at those who hate God and wonder why they are doing well. When I envy the wicked, I'm showing that I don't understand who God really is. I don't really understand God's character. And in a sense, envying the wicked is just another form of me running from God's will for my own life. Psalm 37, if you look there real quick, Psalm 37, the first couple of verses are incredibly helpful for us when we look at other people who are prospering and we don't know why, and it seems so apparent that they're running from God and avoiding God and even hating God. It says, fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity. For they shall soon be cut down like the grass, and wither as the green herb. Trust in the Lord, and do good. So shalt thou dwell in the land, and verily thou shalt be fed. Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart. And so that's the contrast of, here's what it looks like when you choose to go your own way and run from God's good thoughts. You end up in destruction. It may not be destruction today, it may not be destruction tomorrow, but the end is always destruction. But if, on the other hand, I respond to God's good thoughts towards me, if I respond to God's plan towards me and run towards him, the end is blessing. And again, it may not be today, it may not be tomorrow. But the end of following God is always blessing and encouragement. And we see that now in verses 23 and 24. He says, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So here David has made up his mind. He's decided, I'm going to follow God. I'm going to allow God to keep searching me and keep knowing me. And as a result, he's going to lead me in the way everlasting. Sometimes we look at those who hate God and wonder why they are doing well. When we envy the wicked, we show that we don't understand God's true character. And so having talked about God's omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence, David sees clearly the end result of defying God. He sees it as destruction. And then he looks at God's focus, his response towards God. The chapter ends where it started. Look back at the beginning of the chapter. He says, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me." And then verse 23, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts." I used to be afraid of these last two verses. I've heard them preached a lot in a sense where it's like, oh, God's going to search me, and it's going to be painful, and he's going to send lightning bolts down on me, and it's going to hurt. And so these verses can be kind of scary to you. But he's just saying, this is encouraging. This is not bad news. Back at the beginning, he said, thou hast searched me and known me. Now he's saying, God, keep searching me and keep knowing me. And just like it was encouraging at the beginning for God to search us and know us, it's encouraging for us today to say, God, keep searching me. Keep knowing me. What he's saying there is, God, keep setting your mind on me. Keep sending your good thoughts towards me. Keep me in the path of your good thoughts and your good plan, and lead me in the way everlasting. When I return to God and ask him to search me and know me, I am returning to the place I belong. So in conclusion, these may be unprecedented times. It seems like every news cycle brings more bad news as the world goes crazy around us. But we can rest in who our God is. We can rest in his character, his omniscience, his omnipresence, and his omnipotence. Can we take comfort in the fact that he is pressing in close to us, that he's made us perfectly with a perfect plan for us, and that he's thinking good thoughts toward us? And so if we're going to survive these unprecedented times, the answer is not a vaccine, a mask, the election coming up. The answer is focusing on God's character. Because as we orient ourselves to who our awesome God is, then we find he will lead us in the way everlasting, and we will have peace and blessing, even as the world goes crazy around us. So I trust this will be a challenge to us tonight. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word, and thank you for your servant David, that you used to pen scripture and to speak these truths to us. And Lord, I pray that we would focus on you, even as we look at challenges in the world around us. I pray we would draw closer to you, and we would just bask in the goodness that you have poured on us already, and the goodness that you want to keep pouring out on us. And so God, I pray you would continue to search us, continue to know us, and that you would lead us in your way everlasting. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.